I thought this broken shop was empty, until something beneath that wheel called me home.
No apartment, no workshop, no one left to call, just a canvas tool roll and $6 she had kept beneath the lining of her mother's piano bench. And with that amount, she bought a forgotten piano keymaker's shop outside Ivoryton, in Middlesex County, Connecticut, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1978. The east wall leaned 4 inches outward. Rain came through the roof above the cutting room. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, and marked it for demolition the following spring. Yet beneath its grease-blackened polishing wheel waited an iron compartment unopened for more than 30 years, holding money, a diary, and the last honest account of a vanished trade. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Bennett had been fitting broken pieces together her whole life without knowing it. As a child in New Haven, she learned to judge a room by sound. A loose bridge on an upright piano gave a papery rattle. A split soundboard hummed under one note and went quiet under the next. Her mother repaired instruments in the back room of their rented house, and Clara spent afternoons beneath the workbench, sorting felt punchings by color, while rain tapped the basement window. Marion Bennett possessed narrow hands, a tuner's patience, and a way of listening before she answered anyone. She taught Clara that restoration began with restraint. You did not sand away a century merely because the surface looked tired. You found what remained strong, and you worked around it. The deeper craft came from Marion's father, Elias Voss, who lived in a white cottage near Deep River and had once cut piano key veneers for a factory in Ivoryton. Every second Saturday, Clara rode the bus with her mother and carried in a paper sack of rolls. Elias would set a length of cattle bone on the bench, mark it against the grain, and show her how thin usefulness could be. They soaked cut veneers, bleached them beneath window glass in winter sun, then polished the dry surfaces with pumice and water until they held a low pearl sheen. He made her wash every tool before supper, even the ones they had not used. Honest work leaves less behind than dishonest haste, he told her. At 12, she believed he meant dust. At 25, she understood he had meant damage. Elias died in February 2014 after a brief illness that kept him from the bench only 11 days. By the time Clara and Marion reached his cottage, the landlord had cleared the shed. The bone saws, brass templates, bleaching trays, and black treadle wheel were gone. Marion stood in the empty doorway with her gloved hands at her sides. Neither of them asked where the tools had been taken. Years later, Clara opened a small restoration business with a man named Nolan Price. He wore pressed shirts even while moving pianos and kept every receipt clipped square beneath a brass weight. His control arrived quietly. He chose the bank, answered clients before Clara could, corrected her estimates in front of customers, and called caution loyalty. When she objected, he lowered his voice until she felt noisy. On August 18, 2022, she arrived at the workshop and found the account empty. Nolan had forged her signature on a withdrawal slip, taken the restoration fund, and left Connecticut before noon. 3 weeks later, the landlord placed her belongings beside the curb. Clara held her mother's piano bench by one broken leg while Marion stood beneath the awning, dry-eyed, holding an umbrella over herself. You signed nothing, so stop blaming me today. 8 words. Clara counted them because counting was easier than answering. Marion looked toward the traffic. She did not deny having known Nolan planned to leave. She did not offer a room. When the landlord carried out Clara's canvas tool roll, Marion shifted the umbrella against the wind and let the rain darken the bench between them. Clara lifted it alone. For 6 weeks, she moved east by increments. 2 nights in the New Haven bus station reduced her money to $41 after coffee in a locker. In Branford, she slept behind a laundromat where the exhaust vent stayed warm until midnight. In Old Saybrook, a church allowed her 3 nights on a folding cot, though she left before breakfast on the 4th morning because the pastor had begun asking whom he should call. She washed in library restrooms, repaired a waitress's loose chair for soup, and kept the tool roll beneath her coat even when she slept. By the time she reached Essex, she had $11.80. The Essex Library was quiet enough to hear the radiator knock. Clara sat at a public computer searching room rentals, then noticed a classified advertisement scanned from the county surplus bulletin. Structure and land transfer, it read. Former key finishing shop, 18 Walnut Track, Ivoryton, condemned. Purchaser assumes all liability. Minimum bid, $1. A librarian with silver-frame glasses showed her where old maps were kept. The property stood behind a discontinued rail spur beyond the former piano works on less than half an acre. No photograph accompanied the notice. The auction was that afternoon. Clara counted her money beneath the reading lamp, folded $6 into her palm, and placed the rest inside her shoe. Then she rolled Elias's last surviving rasp and canvas, tied the bundle with cord, and walked toward the county building before caution could learn her name. At 4:17, the clerk looked over the empty bidding room and called the property sold. The first bus carried Clara from Essex to Old Saybrook before sunrise, its heater breathing lukewarm air against her wet shoes. A second took her north toward Deep River, where the driver let her off beside Route 154 with 11 miles still between her and the property. She walked until dark, following the river road beneath bare maples, then slept in a hay barn with permission from a farmer whose face she never clearly saw. The temperature fell to 31 degrees. She buried her hands beneath her coat and listened to mice work carefully inside the walls. By morning, the frost had silvered the field. She reached Ivoryton shortly after 10, entering by Main Street with her tool roll across one shoulder and dried hay clinging to her skirt. The village had once been built around quays. Now it seemed to survive through smaller arrangements. The Ivoryton Tavern with its black signboard, Doris Bell's Cafe behind steamed windows, Mercer Hardware beneath a striped awning, a narrow post office with 3 stone steps, and Halloran's Antiques, where a row of cracked metronomes stood in the glass. Above them rose the old factory buildings, pale brick and many-windowed, too large for the quiet streets around them. Clara did not stop. The deed could not be recorded until she signed the liability transfer in person, and the county clerk's annex closed at noon on Fridays. Inside, the office smelled of floor wax, damp wool, and paper stored longer than anyone remembered. A woman with a silver braid sat behind the front counter, turning the pages with the rubber tip of a pencil. Her nameplate read Beatrice Wells, Assistant Clerk. One lens of her spectacles had been repaired at the hinge with pale thread. "You are the buyer," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Wells opened a folder thick with inspection notices. "You understand there is no certificate of occupancy." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been tested since 1991. "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the rear foundation has shifted and the county will not pay for injury, collapse, fire, flooding, or loss." "Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition remains scheduled unless stabilization begins before the first day of March." Clara looked at the final line where her name had been typed above an empty signature box. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Wells watched her for another moment, then turned the folder around. Clara signed with a fountain pen chained to the counter. The nib caught in the cheap paper. Mrs. Wells dusted the page with blotting powder, placed it beneath a brass press, and lowered the handle until the county seal struck with a dull, mechanical thump. "Walnut Track begins behind the old factory canal," she said. "Take Main to North Main, past the cemetery, turn where the pavement narrows beside the stone pump house. The track is not marked. If you reach the river landing, you have gone too far." She opened a shallow drawer for the $6 payment. When Clara unfolded the bills, one of them carried a brown stain across Washington's collar. Mrs. Wells stopped. "What was your grandfather's name?" Clara's fingers remained on the counter. "Elias Voss." The clerk sat back. Outside, a truck passed through the village, making the front windows tremble. "He worked at Comstock and Cheney before the last key room closed," Mrs. Wells said. "My father sharpened saw blades there. Elias was the one who argued against the ivory shipments." Clara had heard only fragments of that argument as a child. Elias would change the subject whenever Marian entered the room. "He said bone could be cut cleanly if people were patient," Mrs. Wells continued. "Most of them laughed. Then he rented a finishing shop on Walnut Track and worked alone for years." Clara looked at the deed. The county record lists the final owner as E. "Voss Manufacturing," Mrs. Wells said. "I assumed it was a coincidence. There were many Voss families along the river." Was it his shop? The clerk removed her spectacles and polished them with a square of flannel. The thread at the hinge loosened, and she pressed it flat with one thumbnail. I cannot prove that from this folder. The transfer records between 1976 and 1982 are incomplete. But your grandfather came here every autumn to pay the land tax in cash. Always exact, always on a Tuesday. She placed the stained dollar in a separate compartment instead of the cash drawer. You should see the building before dark. Walnut Track was little more than 2 muddy wheel ruts beyond the old pump house. Clara followed it past a leaning wire fence and a marsh where reeds moved without birds. At the first bend, an elderly man splitting kindling lifted 2 fingers from the handle of his axe. A red hound beside him gave one low bark, then returned to sniffing the woodpile. "Voss place?" the man called. Clara nodded. "Roof will speak before it falls." That was all he said. The track entered a stand of black walnut trees, their trunks dark from recent rain. Fallen husks broke beneath Clara's shoes, releasing a bitter green smell. Beyond them the shop appeared gradually, as though the woods had been keeping it from view. It was a narrow timber building, perhaps 24 feet wide and 40 feet long, set on fieldstone piers above sinking ground. Weathered clapboards covered 3 sides, the 4th showed patches of tar paper where boards had vanished. The roof sagged between 2 rafters. A short brick chimney rose at the northern end, capped by a rusted coffee tin. Over the door hung a painted wooden sign with only 4 readable letters beneath the lichen. Voss. Clara stood under it until rain began again. The padlock yielded after 3 turns of the county key. When she pushed the door, the lower edge dragged across the floor and released a breath of dust cold enough to taste. The front room held a counter, 2 shelving units, and a small iron stove spotted with rust. Water had marked the plaster in broad yellow fans. Somewhere overhead, a drop struck metal at regular intervals. She'd stepped carefully. The boards answered with separate voices. A dry complaint near the door, a hollow knock beneath the counter, then a long creak running toward the back wall. The air carried old grease, mouse nesting, wet ash, and beneath them something mineral and faintly sweet like a bone dust after rain. A doorway led into the workroom. Her hand found the wall before her eyes adjusted. Flaking plaster rasped beneath her fingertips. The back room was darker and larger, with a cutting bench along one side and a treadle-powered polishing wheel fixed near the center. Its cast-iron base had sunk slightly into the floor. A strip of leather belt hung from the spindle, stiff with age. Clara touched the wheel. It moved half an inch and stopped. The sound it made was low, not a squeal, but a contained iron murmur, as if weight had shifted somewhere inside the base. She did not examine it further. Evening had settled against the windows, and the walk had left her legs trembling. She cleared a space beside the stove with a broom made from bundled twigs, spread her coat over the least warped boards, and ate the heel of bread saved from the hay barn. Rain entered through the cutting-room roof and fell into an enamel basin she had found beneath the bench. Each drop struck with the same patient note. Through the wall came the walnut branches rubbing against the clapboards, then the distant river, broad and steady beyond the marsh. Clara lay with Elias's rasp beneath her palm and the county deed folded inside her blouse. Integrity matters most when no one is watching. By daylight, Clara found the well behind the shop beneath a lid of warped oak boards. The pump handle moved, though not willingly, and after 32 strokes it brought up brown water smelling of iron. She marked the bucket, not for drinking with charcoal. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, tilted toward the marsh but still usable after she nailed a strip of canvas across the broken door. For 3 days she learned the shop through her feet, which boards bent, which ones snapped like dry twigs, and which long complaint near the cutting bench meant weight must be shifted at once. On the 4th morning she walked back to Mercer Hardware. The proprietor was a broad man with one white eyebrow and one brown, both rising independently when he listened. His name was Arthur Mercer. The store smelled of kerosene, oiled rope, cedar shavings, and the hot metal of a radiator placed too close to a nail cabinet. Arthur stood behind the counter, sharpening a carpenter's pencil with a pocket knife. "You're living out there," he said. "I am working out there. That was not my question." Clara set the county deed on the counter, then placed 6 coins beside it. "I need a chimney brush, stove cement, lamp oil, work gloves, and enough food to reach Monday." Arthur looked at the coins but did not touch them. "Credit account," he said, 30 days. You pay something each Friday, even if it is 10 cents. You miss 2 Fridays, I close it. I have no references. You have a condemned building. That is a reference of a kind." He wrote Clara Bennett, walnut track in a ruled ledger, then added a narrow handbook with a blue cloth cover. "My father bought 3 copies after the hurricane of '38, he said. "This one explains how not to burn down what you are trying to save." The account began with only what she could carry: a 6-inch chimney brush for $4.85, stove cement for $1.10, 5 pounds of roofing nails for $2.40, a gallon of lamp oil for $1.65, and 2 canvas dust sheets at 90 cents each. Arthur wrapped the brush handle in burlap so it would not bruise her shoulder on the walk back. The chimney took 6 hours. Clara removed the coffee tin from the top, tied a sash weight to a rope, and lowered it through the flue to test for obstruction. It stopped 9 feet down. She worked from above with the brush, twisting rather than forcing it, then climbed below and opened the stovepipe at the thimble. Creosote fell in dull black scales, some thin as eggshell, others thick enough to hold between finger and thumb. A starling's nest came last, packed with grass, thread, and 1 faded strip of red cloth. She filled 2 buckets before the passage opened. Afterward, she sealed a hairline crack around the stove collar with cement, waited until the surface dulled from black to gray, and laid a test fire no larger than her hand. 3 dry sticks, then 2 pieces of split walnut. Smoke hesitated beneath the lid, found the chimney, and disappeared upward. Clara watched the draft for 20 minutes before adding another piece. Her first hot meal in the shop was oatmeal boiled in a dented saucepan, salted with a packet taken from the bus station. She ate beside the stove while steam clouded the nearest pane. Outside, the wind moved along the marsh, but inside the iron body clicked as it warmed, each sound small and exact. That afternoon, she began the workroom inventory. She found a bone saw with 1 horn handle missing, 3 brass thickness gauges stained green at the edges, a shallow bleaching tray lined with cracked zinc, 2 pumice tins still sealed beneath waxed paper, a foot-powered veneer cutter with its blade removed, and a wooden rack drilled for 88 keys. On the wall hung a paper pattern for an upright keyboard, its measurements written in Elias's narrow hand. The final object was the polishing wheel itself, 4 feet high, with stitched cotton buffs mounted on a horizontal spindle and the collapsed leather treadle strap hanging below. Clara wiped the cast-iron base with kerosene. Under the grease appeared a maker's name from Bridgeport and a border of raised oak leaves. The base should have been open beneath the flywheel, but a circular cedar disc covered the lower cavity. Someone had stained it black to resemble iron. She tapped it with the wooden handle of the brush. The center answered with a deep, hollow note. She tested the surrounding iron, solid. The cedar disc sounded again, softer at the rim and open near the middle. Clara crouched and pressed both palms against it. It did not move. Then she put her shoulder beneath one edge of the wheel and tried to lift the machine. The base was far heavier than its frame required. Something inside had been adding weight for a long time. She worked without hurry. The cedar was held by 4 screws buried under hardened grease. 2 turned after lamp oil was worked into the slots. The 3rd snapped at the head. The 4th had to be cut around with Elias's rasp until Clara could grip it with pliers. When the disc finally loosened, it came forward less than an inch and released a breath of dry cedar, old metal, and cloth. Behind it was a cavity built inside the hollow base. Clara lit the lamp and set it on the floor. The first package had been wrapped in waxed linen and tied with green cord. She carried it to the bench before opening it. Inside lay Elias's ivory-handled marking knife, a small bow saw with a blade as fine as hair, and 6 brass templates labeled with treble and bass measurements. None showed rust. The second bundle contained pale rectangular blanks separated by tissue. Clara held one to the window. The grain was visible, dense and faintly curved. Bone, not ivory. Some pieces had already been bleached, while others retained a warm cream color along their edges. Beneath them rested a black tin cash box. Its latch opened when she pressed both sides at once. Clara did not reach inside immediately. She lifted the box onto the bench, removed a folded diary tied in cotton tape, and placed it beyond the lamp. Under the diary were paper currency and coins packed in narrow canvas rolls. She carried each roll to the front room, where the stove gave steadier light, and counted on the cleared counter. There were $50 and $100 bills, many older than she was, flattened between sheets of drafting paper. The coins included Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half dollars, Indian head cents, and gold eagles wrapped separately in flannel. At the bottom lay a tarnished Purple Heart engraved Elias J. Voss, 1944. She counted once, then again. The total was $43,800. Clara wrote the amount on the back of an old invoice and checked each bundle against it. She did not smile. She did not touch the money except to square its edges and return it to the tin. The figure was too large for the room, too large for the cold stove and the sagging boards and the $11 she had carried into the library. The diary remained unopened. Near midnight she took it outside anyway, holding it beneath her coat as she crossed the walnut grove. The river showed through the trees as a strip of moving pewter. She sat on a fallen trunk above the marsh and watched moonlight break across the current, then gather again beyond each reed. Behind her, the shop windows held one square of lamplight. Integrity matters most when no one is watching. At first light, Clara set the diary beside the stove and untied the cotton tape. The cover opened to pages of measurements, orders, and weather notes, all written in Elias's compressed hand. Near the center, an envelope had been stitched to the binding with linen thread. Clara recognized the writing before she read a word. Her grandfather had formed each capital with the same deliberate downward stroke he used when marking bone. She cut the thread with his knife. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the iron base, then the shop has outlasted me, and you have been patient enough to notice what was made to look ordinary. That is a useful beginning. Dr. Helen Marsh at Middlesex Hospital in Middletown told me on September 8, 2013, that the growth in my pancreas had already traveled farther than an operation could follow. She spoke plainly. I thanked her for it. There are times when kindness means refusing to soften a measurement. The Voss trade began with Matthias Voss, who came from Pennsylvania to Deep River in 1871 and cut combs, buttons, and piano veneers beside the Mill Canal. His son Frederick opened this room in 1902. Frederick's daughter, Ruth, took over the bleaching racks in 1926 after her brother Samuel was killed in France during the First World War. Ruth taught my father Joseph, who kept the shop through the Depression and died in 1964. I was the fourth generation, though for most of my life I pretended that fact carried less weight than it did. The trade closed on October 3, 1978. For more than 30 years afterward, this building stood silent. The factories had changed materials, the orders had gone elsewhere, and people preferred not to discuss where ivory came from. We had already stopped using it. Ruth refused the final shipment in 1931 after seeing photographs brought home by a missionary from East Africa. From then on, we used cattle bone from local butchers, cleaned and prepared with care. It cost us customers. It let us sleep. Should you choose to work here, remember these things. Simmer the bone below 180 degrees Fahrenheit, never at a rolling boil, or the grain will weaken. Use 1 part hydrogen peroxide to 3 parts water for bleaching, and expose the veneers to indirect sun for no more than 4 hours at a time. Leave each piece under weight for 48 hours before cutting it to final width. Mix pumice with enough water to make a thin cream, and polish slowly. Heat and haste produce the same kind of ruin. The money is not payment for owning this place. It is time. Use only what allows the work to continue and keep an account even when no one asks to see it. Inheritance is not the object handed down. It is the unfinished task someone trusted another pair of hands to complete. A tool can be sold. A building can fall. What remains is the habit of making one careful choice when a cheaper one would go unnoticed. If you are family, I hope we were kinder to each other than memory suggests. If you are a stranger, then perhaps the shop chose more wisely than blood ever could. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Joseph Voss, October 12, 2013. Clara read the letter twice. The second time, she rested one finger beneath each line as Elias had taught her to do with measurement tables. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, returned them to the envelope, and pressed the loosened linen thread flat against the binding. The diary mentioned a marker behind the shop, 12 paces from the back door and 3 from the eastern walnut. Clara found it beneath wet leaves, a low granite block with a shallow carving of 3 parallel key veneers. Moss filled the grooves. Below the symbol were the words Ruth Voss, she chose bone. Clara cleaned the face with rainwater in the corner of her sleeve. She did not disturb the earth around it. Back inside, she opened the heirloom bundle and removed a small brass spirit lamp no larger than a teacup. Elias had used it to warm blades before winter cutting. Clara trimmed the blackened wick, filled the reservoir with lamp oil, and struck one match. The flame rose blue at its base, steady and nearly silent. Its light brought other faces into the room. Mrs. Wells had kept the stained dollar apart and told her the truth about the property. The farmer near Deep River had opened his hay barn without asking for a name. Arthur Mercer had written credit into his ledger when Clara owned nothing worth securing. Even the waitress in Brantford had placed a second bowl of soup beside the first and called it payment for a chair that had required only one tightened screw. Perhaps you remember one such kindness from your own life. Something small enough that the person who offered it may have forgotten. What was given to you when you had almost nothing left to give back? That night, Clara wrapped the diary in clean cloth and placed it beside the cash box. Elias's marking knife, bow saw, and brass templates lay in a straight line near her shoulder. She slept on the floor with the old tools within reach and the spirit lamp extinguished between them. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches laid evenly across Walnut Track and the shop roof, where every hollow became visible beneath the white. Clara stood in the yard with Arthur's blue repair manual open against her coat and read the roofing chapter 3 times before climbing the ladder. The main roof measured 26 by 42 feet, including the eaves. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 14 squares of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of felt, and 42 pounds of galvanized nails. The arithmetic used half a page in Elias's ledger. The money column remained untouched. Arthur delivered the shingles in an old farm truck and handed her a roofing hatchet polished smooth at the grip. "My brother used that before he died." Clara weighed it in her palm. "I'll return it sharpened." "No, return it used." The elderly man she had seen splitting kindling arrived the following morning. His name was Walter Boone, and he had roofed houses along the Connecticut River for 41 years. He refused payment by closing Clara's fingers around the coins she offered. They worked 11 days. Walter showed her how to brace the weakened north rafter with a sister rafter bolted alongside it, how to snap a chalk line without letting the blue powder bleed through wet felt, and how to set a nail in 3 strokes. Place, drive, finish. On the 4th day, he touched one shingle with the head of his hammer. That nail's proud. Clara reached for the hatchet. Pull it. The wind sharpened above the ridge, and cedar dust collected in the folds of her gloves. They finished on December 14th. Walter climbed down without ceremony, stood beneath the eaves, and watched melting snow run into the new gutter instead of through the cutting room ceiling. January exposed what smoke had hidden. Several bricks above the roofline had begun to spall, their fired faces breaking away in thin red shells, while the mortar beneath them powdered at the touch of a fingernail. Clara removed only the loose joints, working with a narrow plugging chisel so the sound bricks remained undisturbed. Arthur helped her mix 2 parts hydraulic lime to 1 part fire clay for the interior repairs, adding water by handfuls until the mortar held a clean ridge beneath the trowel. The outer joints received lime mortar without cement, softer than the old brick and able to release moisture rather than trapping it. For 3 weeks, the temperature remained in the 20s. Clara worked from a scaffold wrapped in canvas, keeping the mortar tub near a covered bucket of warm water. Her bare fingers went numb every 15 minutes because gloves dulled the pressure needed to shape the joints. She warmed her hands against a brick heated beside the stove, then climbed again before the mix stiffened. A cracked flue tile near the thimble required 2 attempts. The first patch sagged overnight. The second held after she supported it with a curved piece of sheet metal until the fire clay set. On January 28th, Walter watched from the yard while Clara lit the test fire. Smoke rose through the repaired stack in one narrow column. No gray thread escaped the joints. Inside, the flame drew cleanly toward the flue, and the stove door no longer breathed soot into the room. Walter nodded once. Now it knows which way is out. The floorboards were white pine, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails whose dark facets still showed beneath a century of grime. Clara reset each loose nail with a flat punch, then rented a random orbit sander from Arthur for $14 per day. She made 3 passes. 80 grit lifted the blackened surface and exposed old water stains. 120 softened the machine marks. 220 left the grain closed enough to take oil without becoming slick. She vacuumed between each pass and worked the edges by hand, keeping the sander moving so the soft springwood would not hollow beneath the disc. The first coat of oil disappeared almost immediately. The second remained wet for 12 minutes before she wiped it back with cotton cloths. After the third, the floor cured untouched for 48 hours while Clara slept in the workroom on 2 doors laid across sawhorses. The boards changed from dark honey toward mahogany, not because the wood itself had darkened, but because the old iron stains and years of foot traffic had settled permanently into the grain. Clara left them visible. One morning, she arrived with the sander cord over her shoulder and did not plug it in. A great blue heron stood at the edge of the marsh, still as a blade set upright in water. For nearly an hour it watched the creek. Clara sat on the back step until it lifted away, each wing beat slow enough to count. She performed no work that day. The following morning she returned the rented sander clean, with the cord wound exactly as she had received it. There were 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all, 4 held cracked panes patched with tape or cardboard, and 1 contained a wavering sheet Clara believed had survived since 1788, taken from an earlier building and reused when the shop was raised. She preserved that pane. For the others, she removed the old putty with gentle heat, cleaned each rabbet, and brushed bare wood with linseed oil so it would not draw moisture too quickly from the new compound. DAP 33 glazing putty was rolled between her palms into narrow ropes, pressed beneath the glass, then tooled at an angle that shed rain without covering the sight line from inside. The lower sash in the front room had lost both cords. Clara fitted 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, fed it over the pulleys, and tied a figure-8 knot at each counterweight so the cord could tighten under load without slipping through the iron eye. The first weight struck the pocket wall because she had left the cord 1/2 inch too long. She opened the panel again and corrected it. By the final window, February light had begun to linger past 5. Clara seated the last pane, set the glazing points, and drew her putty knife along the lower edge in one unbroken stroke. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch outside. It turned its black-capped head toward the glass, close enough that Clara could see the small rise of its breast. For several seconds, bird and woman faced one another through the newly restored pane. Then it flew toward the marsh and the sash settled into its frame without a rattle. Behind the loose plaster, Clara found hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven and still marked by the blade that had divided it. Most remained sound. Near the chimney, however, 3 early patches failed before breakfast, sliding from the wall in damp gray folds because she had worked the lime too wet and hurried the suction beneath. Arthur brought an old burlap bag of horsehair from his storage loft. Clara washed it, teased the strands apart, and mixed them through the lime plaster until a handful pulled without breaking. The scratch coat went on first, pressed between the laths and scored diagonally before it hardened. She followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat, leveled by a wooden derby and left to cure 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat measured 1/8 inch, thin enough to follow the wall's old movement rather than disguising it. When the surface had firmed beneath her fingertips, Clara stood back from the chimney and looked at the 3 repaired places. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bell began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before Clara woke. Doris wore red-framed glasses on a chain and folded the tops of the bags twice, always in the same direction. Inside might be 2 biscuits, an apple, or a heel of roast wrapped in butcher paper. Clara carried payment to the cafe after the 3rd delivery. Doris pushed the coins back across the counter with one flour-marked finger. In candles, when the shop reopens, she returned to kneading dough before Clara could answer. Caleb Mercer arrived one Saturday on a black Schwinn bicycle, the handlebar grips worn pale with use. He was 16, long-limbed, and carried a splitting maul across the rear rack as though transporting such things by bicycle were ordinary. He split a month's firewood beneath the walnuts, choosing each round by its grain and setting aside the pieces too twisted for the stove. When Clara offered him money, he rested both hands on the maul handle, my mother said. About your grandfather, he would not explain further. Before leaving, he stacked the wood bark side upward and tightened the bicycle chain with a wrench from his pocket. Reverend Boyd passed the shop each morning on his walk from the parsonage to the village. He had a silver mustache and a slight turn in his left foot that made his hat dip with every second step. He never entered unless invited. On cold mornings he stopped at the gate, touched 2 fingers to the brim, and offered the same 4-word prayer. Keep these hands steady. Clara would lift one hand from the work and wait until he had gone before continuing. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11th, when 3 dry days lowered the seepage along the foundation. The entrance lay beneath a trap-door in the back room. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot floor paved in fieldstone, its joints packed with lime and river sand. At the center rested one dressed granite slab, smoother and lighter than the surrounding stones. A craft mark had been carved into it, 3 narrow veneers beneath a shallow arch. Clara brushed the dust away but did not place a pry bar beneath the edge. Some sealed things deserved to remain sealed until there was a reason stronger than curiosity. Under the 3rd step, she found a small oak box wedged behind a loosened stone. The lid had swollen shut. She carried it upstairs, warmed the joints near the stove, and opened it with a thin palette knife. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped into 3 piano keys. Beneath it was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the same shop before the walnut trees had reached the roofline. She held a narrow veneer saw in one hand and looked directly at the camera with Clara's mouth, Clara's level brow, and the same slight bend in the smallest finger. On the back, written in fading ink, were the words, Ruth Voss, daughter of Frederick, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara placed the photograph beside Elias's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel above the stove. None of the locks in the shop accepted it. Snow withdrew from Walnut Track in gray ridges. The creek behind the marsh grew loud with meltwater, and the black walnuts released pale catkins that trembled whenever the river wind turned inland. Clara did not begin making full key coverings that spring. She knew enough now to understand what she did not yet know. She chose one worn silver coin from the cache, recorded its date and value in the ledger, and exchanged it for peroxide, polishing cloth, cattle bone, and 2 fine saw blades. She practiced on pieces no longer than her thumb, some warped, some scorched beneath the buffing wheel. A few held their shape and took a quiet sheen. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 7, 2024, Clara completed the first full set of key coverings made in the shop since 1978. They were not intended for sale. An upright piano from a school chapel had arrived with 11 missing fronts and a keyboard discolored by years of coal heat. Clara prepared cattle bone below 180 degrees, bleached the cut veneers in diluted peroxide, and left them beneath weighted glass for 48 hours. She shaped each piece against Elias's brass templates, fitted the joints with hide glue, and polished them using pumice mixed to the consistency of thin cream. The final key did not shine brightly. It held the softer luster Elias had preferred, a surface that caught the window and returned only part of it. Clara pressed middle C. The note sounded clean. By then, the front room had white lime-washed walls, a restored counter, and 2 wooden chairs that did not match. The old patterns hung behind glass. Elias's tools remained at the workbench, sharpened but not displayed as relics. The polishing wheel turned on a new leather belt, while its cedar compartment appeared no different from the day Clara first tapped it with a brush handle. The brass key waited on the mantel until the following April. Caleb, now broader through the shoulders and working part-time at the hardware store, came to repair a split limb in the oldest walnut tree. While clearing dead bark near the trunk, he uncovered a narrow brass plate grown nearly flush with the wood. 3 key shapes had been stamped around its edge. Clara brought the key outside. It turned once. A fitted copper cylinder slid from a cavity that had closed around it as the tree widened. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay a folded 48-star American flag and a note written by Ruth Voss on November 11, 1918, the day the armistice ended the First World War. Ruth wrote that the flag had belonged to Samuel, her brother, who had carried it folded inside his pack before he was killed near the Meuse River. Their father could not bear to place it in the house, and their mother would not permit it to be buried. Ruth sealed it in the walnut they had planted together, trusting the living wood to keep what the family could neither display nor surrender. She ended with one instruction. When the flag was found, it should be opened beneath daylight and folded again by more than one pair of hands. Clara and Caleb spread it across the workbench. Arthur held one corner. Doris held another, her red glasses hanging against her apron. Reverend Boyd stood beside the door and spoke no prayer until the folding was complete. The Purple Heart from the iron base was taken to Fountain Hill Cemetery in Deep River on Memorial Day, May 26, 2025. Elias's name did not appear on a war grave there because he had returned home, married, worked, and grown old. Clara placed the medal beside the Voss family stone for the length of the morning service, then returned it to the diary box. Honor, she had learned, did not require permanent display. Of the cash, Clara used 4 coins. The first bought the bone and blades for practice. The second paid for chimney materials after the winter freeze opened a hidden joint. The third purchased a used dust extractor for the workroom. The fourth covered archival cloth, a new tin box, and the engraving of a small brass plate. She did not deposit the remaining money. Each bundle was counted, recorded, and returned to the cavity inside the polishing wheel with Elias's letter, Ruth's tintype, and Clara's repair ledger. The brass plate attached to the inner cedar disc read, "For the next one." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for snow tires and a handwritten offer of piano lessons. Bone Key Repair Old Pianos. Only ask for Clara at Walnut Track. The first customer brought 6 yellowed keys in a cigar box. The second mailed a broken key from Massachusetts after hearing about the work from a tuner. By autumn, Clara kept a list of more than 40 names: church pianist, restoration shops, school custodians, and people unwilling to discard an instrument because one small part had failed. She accepted only the work she could finish carefully. Caleb returned on the 2nd anniversary of the roof repair carrying a hand-carved sign wrapped in a wool blanket. He had copied the surviving letters from the original Voss board and cut the missing ones from walnut. Beneath the restored name, he had added 2 words in smaller letters. Daughters. Clara ran her thumb across the new carving. You spelled it in the plural. Caleb shifted the sign against his shoulder. Seems safer that way. There's only one of me for now. They hung it above the entrance with hand-forged screws. The words did not promise children, heirs, or a future Clara had not chosen. They made room for anyone who might one day arrive with patient hands. That winter, Clara began a letter of her own. She wrote at the front counter after dusk using Elias's fountain pen and a sheet of heavy cream paper. She recorded the roof dates, the chimney mixture, the location of the shut-off valve, and the reason one floorboard near the bleaching racks must never be nailed down. She listed every coin used and every mistake that had cost material. Then she began the part intended for a stranger. My dear one, whoever you are. She explained that the work would sometimes feel too small to matter. A repaired key might return only one note to an instrument no one considered valuable. A patched roof might shelter a craft the larger world had already replaced. The measure was not whether many people noticed. The measure was whether the choice remained honest after the room had emptied. Integrity matters most when no one is watching. Clara folded the letter but did not seal it. There were years of work still to record. On spring evenings, she sometimes left the front door open while the polishing wheel turned. Its treadle made a slow wooden beat beneath her foot. Beyond the restored windows, walnut catkins moved above the marsh, and the river carried the sound toward Deep River without keeping it. The ivory piano, keymaker's shop, waits. It has always waited. At the county annex, Beatrice Wells retired the following June. While clearing her desk, she found the stained dollar Clara had paid on the day of the auction. She placed it in a narrow envelope marked Walnut Track and left it in the back of the drawer for the next clerk, beside the brass stamp and the old directions to the shop.